Okay. Now when it comes to CBGM, I have seen people pull up these wonderful looking charts, and they've got like arrows absolutely everywhere. Could you show us a chart? Just give us an example. Can you show us a chart
Yeah.
and how you use it to make sense of the information it's presenting? So what do you do with that chart?
Sort of we can skip ahead to the more fun charts. This is just something that I put together that kind of describes how people use the CBGM and sort of where you start with the limited amount of knowledge that you have about the text. And then you make the judgments that you can make. We'll describe what a local stemma is in just a moment. You use that to kind of calculate relationships between witnesses over the whole text, and those allow you to make judgments about coherence or textual flow. That in turn can help you refine your judgments about the readings themselves. And this is that
Right.
iterative circle that I told you about. So this is kind of the big thing that the CBGM allows you to do to improve the state of the art from where we were before.
Oh, I see. So like if you go through and you examine two manuscripts and say you find like 20 variants between the two manuscripts,
Mhm.
and you might make a judgment that this isn't really coherent enough. So you can plug it back into the system and make a couple more choices to try and
Yeah.
whittle that down. Is that and would that does
Yeah.
that so what's the input and what's the output? What do you put into CBGM and then what do you get out?
You need a couple things. So you need to have a collation. So just you have to first figure out all the places where your manuscript witnesses disagree, and then kind of have their texts aligned so that you're comparing apples to apples.
Okay. And you're only doing that
Um,
with two manuscripts at a time, or can you do it with multiple manuscripts at
you
a
can
time?
do it with multiple.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then the other thing you need to have is sort of your initial judgments about which readings are earlier than which other readings. That is encoded in this little graph called a local stemma. Collation there. This is just for text in 3rd John, but these are the variation units and these are the variant readings. And these here are the witnesses in the rows.
Sorry,
You can
what
hit,
do these letters represent in there? I know that on the left hand column you have manuscript numbers, and
yes.
then in the top headers you've got passages. But what's in the middle there with the A, the B, AFL, and all that?
These represent variant readings. We could write out the full content of those readings here, but it would make it a much larger table. So we just kind of
Right.
shorthands. So I'll move on to show you a local stemma. I've provided sort of an extended legend here so you can kind of see what's actually happening in terms of the text. We're here in 3rd John 1:4. These numbers at the end here just represent sort of the word index, so we know like where in the verse we are. The text of I think most manuscripts end up saying en aletheia peripatunta. Under that we also have a defective version or a misspelling of that reading. It has a omicron instead of an alpha at the end there. The scribe misspelled it. For the purposes of the CBGM, we don't really count these as different readings. We know what the scribe meant, so we kind of just collapse it with the reading that it came from. So that's why
Okay.
this line here is dotted.
That would be an example of some editorial subjective decision making, right? That sounded really fancy, where you have to decide whether or not this is something that a scribe didn't actually mean, right? Like if it's a spelling error, there's a
I
certain
think in some
subjectiveness
ways,
to that. Yeah.
for sure. Like I think a lot of that stuff happens on the part of text critics without them really even giving much thought to it, because like we have so much experience in like dealing with what scribes, the changes that we see scribes making, that we kind of get a feel for which ones are common. And usually with things like misspellings, like we don't really consider it substantive because I don't know, it doesn't really change the sense in any meaningful way. And sometimes like a change can be subtle, but it can still count as a distinct thing. So like in
Right,
reading
right,
B, we just have the only difference is that somebody's added the article
right.
before the word truth, and it's still different. So we count that differently, and then we have its reading here. And then sometimes the scribe might transpose the word order, which is also significant for other reasons. So we have all of our sort of substantive readings, and like the defective one here. This last one that we have here is what we would call an ambiguous reading. So
Okay.
what happened in one or more manuscripts is that we have the start of the text where we have the word N, but then there's this gap, damage to the page or illegible writing or something. And
Okay.
what that results in is like we got 13 to 15 letters that we can't make out. But then after that, we see the rest of this word.
Okay. Okay. Now that doesn't break CBGM when there's lacuna there.
No, you don't have to. I mean, in reality, like you wouldn't probably treat this as a separate reading just because you know that it probably used to be one of these other readings before the damage happened. And in this case, we can guess that it was either reading A or reading B. and it wouldn't have been either of these other two because we know it starts with N and it ends with tunta. The way that you can encode that is you can just have that as reading that could be resolved either to this reading B or to this reading A.
Okay.
And that way, a witness that has reading A would be treated as agreeing with it. A witness that has reading B would also be treated as agreeing with it.
Okay, I see. So basically what that's saying is ZW with the 13 to 15 letters missing. There's not really any certainty whether that is something that comes from reading B or reading A.
Yeah, we don't know. It could be either. You encounter the same thing if you're working with versional data. So like if you have something in Latin and it has like in veritate, like it could be reading A or it could be reading
Right.
B. We don't know because Latin doesn't have articles.
That's right. Yeah. Okay.
So that they can happen with that. And then like with patristic citations, like if the church fathers are like really paraphrasing it, you might not know for sure like what he read, but you might be able to rule out some things that he wouldn't have read. Yeah, you have options that covers all those readings except for this one up here.
So on this reading, sorry, on this little chart
ahead.
here, then what you're suggesting is that reading A is the one that likely caused reading B, C, D, and potentially ZW. A would be the original to B, C, not necessarily the original, but the one that produced the other reading. So A would be closer according to what you're showing here.
Exactly. I mean, it's the local stemma is just basically a graphical representation of the judgments that textual critics make. And in this case, like it seems like the earliest reading is A. Now we have this reading D2 over here, this is called a split. The way that this arises in the CBGM is if we have witnesses that have reading D, and those witnesses seem to be pretty coherent pre-genealogically, so like they seem to form a group, but we've also noticed that like there's some other group of witnesses that's not close to them that doesn't agree with them most of the time, and it happens to have the same reading. So what we do is we kind of split those readings apart, even though they're the same reading, and we treat them as arising in different places in the tradition.
So that's like this is so wild, we just don't even know what to do with it. So it just kind of gets left off to the side.
Yeah, and occasionally you do see this happen in the CBGM, like where you can look through the local stemma that the editors have produced online. Like you'll see several instances where like they just didn't know where something came from, so there's a question mark there. For their purposes, it's not really a huge problem. Like this is where if you look in your NA28, you'll see like the diamond there, and that would indicate one of these two things was probably original, but we don't know which one.
Okay, so what do you do with this now that you have the chart all done and set up there? What do you do with that?
Now that we have this, it allows us, and if we do this for like a bunch of other variation units throughout like the book of 3rd John, for instance, then we can kind of get paint this bigger picture of what's going on between two witnesses. Here's a list of variation units where we have one witness that I've just called W1, another witness I've called W2. Right. And at each variation unit, we have a different local stemma describing the relationships of the readings there. Right here, and at most of these, like it looks like we have reading A giving rise to reading B. Over here on this 4th one, we have 3 different readings, and A gives rise to B and C. And on this last one over here, we know that A gave rise to B, but we don't know where C came from.
And all this is done strictly based on what the reading is, not necessarily what manuscript the reading was attached to.
If you're a thoroughgoing eclectic, then you can do it that way. I think in practice, people who are like more reasoned eclectics and kind of try to balance the manuscript and the readings will pay attention to both when they make these judgments. The manuscript that has
so this essentially is where the judgment is itself when it decided which reading gave rise to the next reading. That's the judgment. That's where all your principles are applied to. And so sounds like all CGBM really does is it collates the manuscripts for you, presents the data to you, tells you to make some decisions, and then there's some sort of recursive process that you're talking about now where you sort of feed it back in. At this stage here, we've made some decisions on which reading we think is, and we've come up with reading A on the top. So I'm assuming that means we think that A is closer to the original.
Yeah.
Is that a fair assumption?
Yeah. So in this judgment, like we think A is more likely to be original, so we put it at the top.
Okay. So what would tell us at this point that this isn't really good enough and we need to use recursion?
Okay.
narrow it down a little further.
So what we do for that is we use what's called a textual flow diagram, and the textual flow diagram is kind of informed by what's happening at a larger scale between all of these variation units. We're using kind of the broad picture to kind of figure out what's happening at one variation unit. Yeah, we have these different types of relationships. The most important ones to note are where we have agreements, and that governs like pre-genealogical coherence, prior relationships, where one witness has a reading that's earlier than the other one or prior to it, and posterior relationships where one witness has a reading after the other one. So you kind of want to tabulate up how many times this happens and how many times this happens between these two witnesses. If this happens more often, then we're going to say that witness W1 is a potential ancestor to witness W2 because it has more prior readings than posterior readings.
And is that like an actual chronological time? So now we've taken the readings, we've made some judgments, and those judgments, as opposed to using something like paleographic dating to put a manuscript at a certain age. Clearly, we're not doing that here. You can determine which manuscript is early relative to the one you're collating against, right? If you got two, you could tell which one was earlier and which one wasn't.
Right, and it's based on the readings and not like the age of the manuscript or
Right.
any external factors. Like I said earlier, the CBGM kind of tries to divorce the text of a manuscript from the manuscript itself, because we're talking about sort of these layers or textual like strata of textual development over time.
Yep.
And we kind of have to abstract things in order to do that properly. There we go.
So would there ever be a scenario where the output from a CBGM session says one is earlier, but then like paleontology shows that it's not? Has there ever been sort of a mismatch between the two?
I think that can happen, and I'm sure that there are instances where it has. I mean, certainly when you look at like a textual flow diagram, you'll see a bunch of witnesses sort of in that top level just below the initial text, but like
Right.
they vary pretty widely in age. Like they're not all equally early manuscript. So like yeah, you can see a big difference there because of how you're dealing with the text and not the manuscript. Yeah, and like over here, you kind of see like that the scale that you have here isn't really time as much as it is prior readings versus posterior readings.
Okay, so what chart are we looking at now?
So this is an illustration of how potential ancestry works in the CBGM. For the ECM committee, manuscript 03, which is a Codex Vaticanus, is considered to have a lot of the earliest readings. And because its readings are decided to be some of the earliest in the local stemmata, whenever it's compared to another witness, it will usually turn out to be earlier or prior than that to that witness in terms of its readings. So you see how it has that relationship to all these other witnesses, but then those witnesses can have similar relationships to the other witnesses as well. So like 35 here, might have earlier readings than 1739, 453, and these other witnesses. So it kind of appears at this point on the spectrum, and then so on and so forth as we go down from earlier readings to kind of generally later ones.
And 1611. That's funny. Shout out to all my KGV friends. Yeah, that's right. So in this manuscript, what am I saying? So in this chart here, what it's saying then is manuscript 35. I'm thinking Pickering's F35 text, right? So manuscript 35 looks like it's very closely related. Let me rephrase that. Relatively closely related to 03, Sinaiticus, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then 1739 seems to be a step removed from that, having coherence with manuscript 35 and also some influence from Sinaiticus. And then in 453, you've got influence from all three of them. Am I reading that right?
So it might be a little bit misleading because like all these arrows pointing at different places kind of do suggest like that mixture's going on, but that's not really what this graph is describing.
Right. Okay.
I can show you a graph later where that does come into play.
Sure.
And where it does mean that. But yeah, what's happening here is just the arrow means in the CBGM, this witness is considered a potential ancestor of this one. We don't know if it's an actual ancestor or not, but and the reason that we do that is that we can use it a little bit later for textual flow.
Yeah. Now this is the chart that I was talking about at the beginning.
Yeah.
So I've seen this. It's huge. It's got tons of stuff going on here. So what we've done so far is we've taken a reading. We've had the system collate it. We made some judgments, and then we've compared it with a larger pool of manuscripts. And those in the last screen, we were looking at a number of different manuscripts and their relation with each other. And then now we've got this humongous thing. What is going on here?
So we'll obviously need to zoom in a little bit, but those various relationships that we have between witnesses kind of tell us which ones are potential ancestors of which other ones, and that is part of how we construct this, because in a textual flow diagram, like a witness like 33 here, its parents in this diagram can only be witnesses that are its potential ancestors. So the idea is that like every time you move down this chain a little bit, you're moving from a space that has more prior readings to one that has more posterior readings. So like
Right.
you're getting later and later readings as you move down.
So you can see this as the topmost circles in this diagram as having the earliest readings.
Yeah, and there's this placeholder here, like the capital A. In a CBGM, this is called the Ausgangstext. In English, usually it's just called the initial text. It's our placeholder for what we think, the earliest text read. So it's like this conglomerate of all of those readings that we have at the top of our local stemma in every case.
Okay, so this chart then represents the whole of the manuscript tradition, at least as far up to as you've done some work.
Sort of like
a large overall picture.
It's a general picture of coherence, like you mentioned. Like we don't. It's working with incomplete information because there's some local stemma where we haven't made decisions on the readings, or we have loose ends to tie up, and also because this right here is actually not covering like the whole tradition, or not the whole set of variation units, but just one specific variation unit. So like over here, you can see that this textual flow diagram is specifically for 3 John 1:13. And that's necessary because of how we construct it. The way you construct a textual flow diagram is if you want to figure out the ancestor of a witness like 617, then you've got to list all of its potential ancestors. And then if there's one of them that has its same reading in this variation unit, in this case, if it has reading C, then you'll just have it descend from the closest potential ancestor that also has reading C. You can't always do that though. So in this case, 617 has reading C. The closest ancestor it has is the Ausgangstext with reading A, and it doesn't have any other potential ancestor with the same reading. So
this isn't saying that there isn't necessarily a parent to 617, but that we just don't have it or aren't aware of any.
And yeah, the best thing that we can do in this textual flow diagram then is say that there must have been a change somewhere from here to here, and that's why the edge is colored blue.
Yeah, so if we're looking at the data here, 617 has reading C from our previous page, and it gave rise to reading C on lectionary 1281.
Yep. I mean,
and then was that the end of the line for election 1281? Like nothing had been copied from that?
It doesn't necessarily say something about the textual history, but it does say that for these other witnesses that have reading C, they all tend to be closer to some other witness like lectionary 938 that has the same reading.
Okay. So why does L938 have a whole bunch of arrows coming out of it pointing to another manuscript, but L1281 doesn't?
So my guess is that this might have some gaps in it. It might be partially lacunose. If not, it's possible that L938 just seems to have more of a common core of readings with most of these later witnesses, and so because it agrees with them more.
So this isn't linking the readings together specifically. It's linking like manuscripts when you take them as a whole.
Exactly.
Okay, gotcha. Okay.
The reading comes into play because you have to, like, if you can, you want to make sure that you connect a witness to another witness that has the same reading.
Okay, perfect. I get it. I understand now. It wasn't making sense to me for a second there. Okay.
No, I'm so glad.
So all these manuscripts then with arrows have the same reading here, but they may be different. Well, they will be different in other parts, so much so that it means they're not on the same line as L938, for example.
Exactly. Yeah. So because they share the same reading here, they're connected to each other, and they connect to this one rather than this one because they're closer to this one.
Right. Okay. That makes sense. Okay. So now we have this chart. So when it comes to like constructing our Greek New Testament, what do you do with this chart?
Okay. So you could do a few things with it. One of the things is, we might have like gaps in our local stemma where we're not sure where a certain reading came from. I don't know where reading F came from. What we can do is we can look at our local stemma or our textual flow diagram. We can find something with reading F here, and we can see where it came from. And what we notice here is that sort of the closest potential ancestor to 61 is 326. That witness has reading B. So it could be that reading B gave rise to reading F here. It's something we'd have to re-examine in terms of the readings themselves, but it sort of points us in that direction.
So when I look at this, right, you see it looks like it's in levels, right? So you got A at the top, and then you've got the next level. I'm assuming that each level that's closest to the top represents something that's a little closer to the Ausgang text.
Yes.
So when we look at manuscript 61, which has the reading F, which is totally out of place, right? Because I don't see any other F readings on there. we conclude that it came from B, and that conclusion was based off of a judgment call made by someone like yourself, or another textual critic who did some work. And then CBGM, or at least the system behind it, had taken all of those judgments and put them in these manuscripts and presented this data like this to you. Is that how it works?
We have our manuscript data, and then we kind of make a first pass of judgments on the stuff that we're more sure about.
Yeah.
And even with just like that partial information, we can still construct this diagram. And what this does for us is it kind of gives us a sense of what's happening generally between different manuscripts. And in this case, because 61 and 326 are generally pretty close to each other, we have reason to believe, even if we're not sure about it, that reading B could have given rise to reading F.
So what's next in the process?
The idea is that you'll take this, you can update your local stemmata based on what you find in your textual flow diagrams, and you keep doing that until you feel reasonably satisfied with the results. The idea is that eventually you'll reach a point where you filled out most of your local stemmata, and the results that you're seeing in here seem to be pretty stable with that. Occasionally, like, you might have a witness giving rise to another witness in the textual flow diagram where their readings actually, like, that change between readings isn't something that we have on the text or on the local stemma. Like, even if we already tried to set it that way, the textual flow diagram just cares about what's happening generally between the two manuscripts and whether or not they agree at this unit. So it can sometimes question our judgments, but that's kind of a healthy thing because it forces us to revisit them.
Yeah, of course.
There's other ways of filtering down parts of that textual flow diagram to the parts that we care about. So like if we only cared about the places where one reading changes to another, then we can just include the witnesses and ancestors where that happens. So this is a coherence invariant attestations diagram.
Okay.
Very similar, like all the edges here are blue because they all describe places where one reading changes to another in the textual flow diagram. You also have these like edges that are, some are thicker, some are thinner, some are dashed, some are dotted. You can use that sort of as a way to calculate sort of the strength of that relationship. And what that really means is if I changed a few readings, or if I changed a few relationships in the local stemma, how likely would that be to turn around this relationship in the textual flow diagram?
Right.
It's basically telling you how safe you are to change your judgment on that. So like if you have something like a really thick line here, it's telling you if you change your judgment here in the local stemma to say like that reading A, or that like something else gave rise to reading F, it wouldn't really affect the relationship between these two witnesses. This one would still be prior to this one.
Oh, I see. So the thicker the line, the more stable the relationship is between the two manuscripts.
Yeah, so like you can tinker around with your judgments a little bit more freely with that without worrying that's going to kind of change a lot of stuff in the textual flow diagram.
When we talk about stability in manuscripts, we are talking about like say two manuscripts collated together. If it's more stable, there's very few variants between the two, and if it's less stable, there's more variants between the two. Is that what you mean by stability?
Not exactly. We'd say that they have like high pre-genealogical coherence if they agree a lot, but here it's more that like high stability is one manuscript has a lot of earlier readings than the other manuscript. So like even if you changed your mind about which readings were earlier and which ones were later, like that relationship in general would still hold.
Right. So a lot of abstract thinking goes into something like this. It's very, very abstract.
Unfortunately, it's made it kind of hard for people to explain it to lay people.
Yeah, and that's the thing, right? Like when we talk about abstraction, right? It's something that I'm familiar with from the software development world, right? Like you take these ideas and then you bundle up your programs into objects with properties, and like that's what we mean by abstraction. Not that it's like an abstract painting. But,
yeah, sorry.
But yeah, it's very very abstract in the way that this kind of goes about, with the stem and skeleton essentially surrounding how this is put together. Yeah, that's some heavy stuff. Heavy stuff. And you have to be awake to be able to roll through some of this. That's incredible. So what else you got there? Explain.
Okay, so I feel like the last step is the construction of the global stemma. The global stemma is sort of the closest thing that the CBGM has to that traditional family tree of manuscripts that like the traditional genealogical method provides you. It's still different in substantial ways, and I can show you those in a bit. I think like the first thing we got to cover is how you construct it and like what constraints you have to respect in order to do that. Over here, I have a similar diagram to the one I showed you earlier. In this case, we'll just use a couple actual witnesses here.
Okay.
But we have their variation units here at the top, their readings here, the local stemmata for each of those variation units describing how their readings are related. And then there's this last row here, and it's basically just telling you, does the first witness explain the second witness at that unit? What we mean when we say that one reading explains another in the CBGM is that either their readings agree at that variation unit, the reading of the first witness has an arrow pointing down to the second witness's reading at
Right.
that unit. So basically it says like you either agree on the same reading or you gave rise to the reading that the other one has. And so you'll see like in these first three instances, 1832 here does explain 2243 in these first two cases because it has a prior reading, and in this last case because they agree. It doesn't explain it here because in this case 2243 actually has the earlier reading.
Right.
And over here, it doesn't explain it because they just have independent readings.
So what do you do with those readings that don't explain it? Do you just kind of like keep those, or do you try to resolve those? Or is that sort of left in the system for another kick at the can, so to speak?
So certainly if you have reason to suspect that maybe that relationship is off, like you could revisit your local stemma and then try to change this relationship. But that's not always what you have to do. In some cases, this might happen because of mixture. So like if 2243 has 1832 as one of its sources, but it has some other manuscript as another source, then it might have gotten these readings from that other source. And so you have to bring in another witness and say, okay, where does this witness explain 2243? Okay. That will allow you to kind of figure out, okay, once you cover every one of those variation units, once you have checkboxes in every single one of them, just between all of the potential parents that manuscript has, then you've explained it and you can put it into the global stemma.
And then the global stemma is what's used to basically say this reading we're putting into whether it's ECM or whatever other NA29 or whatever is being used, right? Is that how that works?
Not exactly. I mean, the thing about the global stemma is that it's not really a necessary part of the process. Once you use the textual flow diagrams and you decide everything in the local stemmata, you kind of have all the judgments that you would need to have just to print out the ECM.
So it's more like a helper step. Helps you visualize everything that's occurred.
Yeah, it's sort of this nice sort of final ornament to put on the tree. Just kind of like gives you a good sense of what the tradition looked like. So,
oh wow.
Here's one here.
This is really big.
Yeah, so these are not normally colored like this. I've colored this one in with information about different groups. Like you have a legend here that has what the different groups are. Blue is the Byzantine, red here is the Alexandrian. We've got different smaller families here. And a lot of these were identified by Klaus Wachtel in his book on the Byzantine text.
Okay.
There's a lot of smaller groups in the Catholic epistles and in Paul's epistles, pretty much in every corpus of the New Testament. But what's neat about it is that, like, this global stemma, which accounts for every reading and every witness, it still preserves a lot of those coherent relationships that we would expect the witnesses to have. So like here we see like the Byzantine text kind of taking up a good portion of the diagram. We have actually the majority here. And then all the individual witnesses showing up farther down. 025, it seems like a pretty central witness just because a lot of other witnesses are very close to it. They kind of come in this later layer. But even down here, you also see like some of these other groups that kind of seem to be pretty well connected. In some cases, you can see how they might influence other groups or kind of spread readings to other parts of the tradition. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot going on, obviously, and it means more when you are more familiar with the witnesses themselves and their groups and all that. But
yeah, I could see somebody who would like not know anything would look at this and be like, oh, look, a bunch of circles and lines. Like, what am I going to do with that? But yeah, that's, I mean, that looks insanely complicated. Part of me goes, well, that's good that a computer's doing some of that.
Yeah, and I mean, you can kind of see the reason why they don't bother going to this length, when they already have everything they need for the ECM. Like, it doesn't add too much information that's really helpful for what you'll probably be doing as a textual critic. What it does kind of help you with is it shows you these places where maybe there was mixture, and you can kind of keep that in mind when you evaluate sort of the integrity or the character of a manuscript in later judgments.
So with all these charts and stuff, would you say that this is kind of doing away with the four classic text types that we often talk about, Caesarean, Western, Alexandrian, Byzantine? Is that now like gone in modern text criticism? Like, do we no longer talk in that way or think about them in text types?
I think that with the development of the CBGM, there's been a move towards kind of saying like we don't need text types anymore. And I think in some ways that's justified because when you have sort of a family tree, a text type is just basically another way of saying the tree
all
starting at
related.
this branch up here. It's kind of subjective because like where do you decide where to cut it off to form a text type?
Which is kind of like the same issue you have when trying to determine coherence, right? Like what percentage of matching do the manuscripts have to be in order to be considered coherent?
Yeah, exactly. Good.
Yeah.
Thank you
Yeah.
for bringing it back there. You circled it back.
Yeah. Do you see CBGM as replacing? Is that like the next big thing in textual criticism? Is that like where we're headed?
The leading textual critics at institutes like the International Greek New Testament Project and the INTF in Munster, because they're so deeply involved with it, I think want it to be the next thing. There's been a couple obstacles. Like one of them is that it's still hard for a lot of people to grasp how it works.
It's interesting too because in talking to some people, it seems to be hit or miss, right? Whether people think it's a good tool to be used, or whether it's something that's is probably not as helpful. I think earlier we were talking. You said that you don't think it's the best way. So what is the best way?
This is of course coming from my bias and then my own experience and stuff. I do think that phylogenetics, or like the construction of family trees based on common errors and I think transcriptional factors, a lot of different things put into a model is a bit more robust and a bit more rigorous, and it also allows you to kind of reconstruct hypothetical ancestors to kind of build up the parts of the tree that you don't have anymore. The CBGM kind of tries to work around that in a different way that I don't find very satisfactory. And I mean, on the other hand, it's the trade-off, of course, is that it's a little bit harder to deal with mixture with traditional methods, and that's sort of a thing that pro CBGM people will bring up. Like that's the reason they developed it. But I do think that even if like you borrow other techniques from biology, you'll find that there have been ways developed to kind of deal with the problem of mixture, and I think that you could do it in a satisfactory way. But that'll be for me to figure out with the rest of my PhD research.
That's right. You'll have to let us know.
Yeah.
So what did you call it again?
Phylogenetics.
Phylogenetics.
So like philo for tree, genetics for the genetic part.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that sounds like a good idea for another video after we give our brains a little bit of time to come back from that. Thank you so much for coming on the channel and sharing with us your knowledge. I hope sometime in the future you'll be able to come back on the channel and share some of your new findings.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. It's really been an honor being on here. Thanks for inviting me. I hope it's been informative for everyone.
Great. Well, anyway, brothers and sisters, I hope you found this informative. And until next time, we'll see you around.